So, what have we talked about today? We've talked about consumer confidence possibly leading to a recession. You don't know. It could happen. It's not impossible. All right, but a lot of this with the consumer confidence, it seems to be that we're losing faith in our government. Okay, our government is not exactly giving us confidence in ourselves. Okay, it's not giving us confidence in the future. A lot of how they've handled the COVID thing, it just seems all sizzle and no steak to a lot of us, and that might be why these economists that I talked about in the last segment might think that we're on the verge of recession. Well, speaking of our government and losing faith in it, now there's actually I know that I had brought to you guys the story about the Keep Nine Commission trying to get an amendment to keep 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Because, of course, we don't want the Supreme Court to turn into some sort of a dictatorial whatever, in which we have too many justices. We can't keep track of all of them. Let's just keep it the way it is. All right, well, there's a movement now to try to stop the packing of the Supreme Court, possibly with an amendment. And I am being joined now by Paul Sommers, who is the former Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that are going on with. Now, Paul, I guess you guys are you've sent a letter to a presidential commission about some of this?
Yes, we have. And first of all, thank you for allowing me to be on the program.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. It's great to have you on all the time. So tell me a little bit about what you guys are doing right now.
We are promoting a 13-word amendment to the United States Constitution, which would be the 28th Amendment. And basically it says that the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. The Constitution is silent as to the number of justices. It has been 9 for 152 years. We want to keep it like that because we want to avoid or eliminate court packing. Court packing is basically increasing or decreasing the number of members of the court and replacing them with people of the same political ideology. That would be bad. It would denigrate the independence of the court system, and we want to prevent that. I represent a bipartisan, I repeat, a bipartisan group of former attorneys general who promote this amendment. We recently wrote to the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court, and I'll be glad to share you the content of that letter that we wrote to them last week.
All right. Well, first off, fill me in on this. You say that we've only had 9 justices on the Supreme Court for 150 years. Well, what was going on with the Supreme Court before that?
Well, our country began in 1789 when our first Constitution, was ratified. We started with 6 Supreme Court justices. It changed 5 times. The most that we have had is 10. That was 10 in 1869, and then it was reduced by the Congress to 9, and we have had 9 ever since. All it takes to add or detract or subtract from the Supreme Court, or any court for that, is for Congress to pass an act, and then for the President to sign that act, either increase or decrease. We feel like doing that, or court packing as we call it, is commonly called, what not only denigrates the independence of the court system, but secondly, violates the rule of law. And then thirdly, we've got to remember that the Supreme Court acts and balances on abuse of power of the other branches. We cannot stand for that, and that's why this bipartisan group of former attorneys general supports the Keep Nine Amendment. And these are fellows that used to represent their state, and they know about the Supreme Court, how important it is to be independent.
Okay, so there's 17 former attorneys general. So now are these clearly they're from completely different political leanings, I imagine.
Interestingly enough, I did a brief survey of the. Steve Rosenthal, a Democrat, former Attorney General of Virginia. He co-chair the coalition to preserve the independence of the U.S. Supreme Court. We both wrote a week ago to all the former attorneys general that he knew, and within 3 or 4 days, 17 of them responded to us. Of the 17, Steve advises me that about 2 to 1, interestingly enough, are Democrats. That's not exactly the, but it's a little bit. It certainly is more than a majority of the Democrats. And also, this whole coalition began about years ago when 15 former attorneys general, 8 of whom were Democrats, 7 were Republicans, formed this coalition, and it's definitely bipartisan. It's definitely none.
Okay, well, that's interesting that so many of them are Democrats when, I think what some of the fear about this is that the Democrat president has talked about packing the Supreme Court. So clearly you guys are not a completely partisan group.
We're definitely not a partisan group. We're trying the right thing. We have been there. We realize that the judicial branch is the third branch is independent, should be independent, and acts as a check and balance against abuse of power by the other 2 branches particularly. We want to keep it that way. We want to make sure that a 9 constitutional amendment would act as a firewall against court packing. All it takes, right, is a majority vote in the House and a vote in the Senate, and the president signed the bill, and you can increase it. We don't want 25 years from now for some child on Thanksgiving Day to come up to his or her granddaddy and say, "Granddaddy, why do we have 31 members on the United States Supreme Court? We don't want to be like some of those banana republics."
Okay. All right. So you just sent a letter to a presidential commission. Tell me a little bit about this letter.
Well, in this letter, we wrote to them because the commission's purpose was to provide an analysis of the principal arguments in what they call the contemporary public debate for and against the Supreme Court reform. And there's no specific proposal for Supreme Court reform that has more Congress and across the than this Q9 amendment. The commission's heard persuasive testimony that expands the number of justices and would undermine the independence of the court. And we want to make sure that they understand that the Q9 amendment would ensure that no future Congress and president, regardless of party, could manipulate the number of justices on the Supreme Court. That's why we wrote it. Let me tell you how much support we have. The resolution that originally was introduced in Congress by Representative Colin Peterson of Minnesota, who was a Democrat, by the way, in September of 2020, and is now backed by more than 200 members of Congress and a bipartisan total of more than 1,000 elected officials nationwide. This commission needs to study this. It doesn't just need to say, well, we don't think court packing is good. We want them to study this particular piece of potential legislation or potential constitutional amendment to see what they think of it, and we want them to direct their attention to keep 9 amendments.
All right. Do you guys, where do you see all of this going? I mean, are you guys going to end up being, part of a Supreme Court decision or legislation that's going to be passed among the states?
No, we don't. There are 2 ways to amend the Constitution. By the way, since 1789, we've had 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Of course, the Bill of Rights, which, as we all know, were the first 10, and they were ratified about 2 years after the original Constitution was ratified. Basically, an amendment has to have 2/3 vote of both the House and Senate. And then after it has 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate, then it is forwarded to all of the states, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That sometimes is a long process. Sometimes it's not such a long process. But the bottom line is what we hope is that we can get this conversation going such that people on a bipartisan basis will realize this needs to be a firewall against court packing, and we need to have it in the Constitution. Quite frankly, Jim, I think there are a lot of people that didn't even know that the Supreme Court at 9 was in the Constitution. They probably thought it was a given. We want to make sure it's a given.
Okay. All right. So what are some of the things that you guys are working on in the future to get this completely taken care of, other than just getting people to talk about it?
Well, what we don't want to happen is for the commission or the conversation to die down pending the 2020 midterm elections. We want this issue to be front and center, and that is a two-part question. If you're running for Congress, or if you're running for one of the Senate slots next year, then there are two questions that should be asked of every candidate. A, are you for or are you against court? Most of them will probably say, I'm against court packing. Not a good thing. That's only half the question. The other half of the question is that if you are against court packing, do you favor the Keep 9 amendment, or do you not favor it? If they waffle whatsoever, then that means that they basically want to take the conversation away from court packing. They want to reserve it for another day when they have the power to pass court packing bill.
All right. Well, Paul Sommers, former Attorney General of Tennessee, talking about the Keep 9 amendment and efforts to keep our Supreme Court with 9 justices and keeping it fair. Paul, is there anything else you'd like to add before we end this segment of the show?
Let me just tell you of the 17 attorneys general that wrote the letter to the commission asking them to fit the Keep 9 amendment as part of the Supreme Court reform. Let me tell you the states or the territories that they represented: Tennessee, Virginia, Guam, Puerto Rico, Florida, Ohio, Massachusetts, Hawaii, Nevada, Colorado, North Carolina, and New York. A real cross-section of the United States, and I'm so proud of them for stepping forward to do the right thing. They were both Democrats and Republicans who did this.
Now, you know something, our Attorney General Mark Brnovich, I would think this would be something that he would be interested in. I mean, he's gotten into a lot of court battles, even on the campaign trail, as he continues his Senate run. Have you heard anything from Mark Brnovich at all over here in Arizona?
No, but I tell you what, I know the person who can answer that question. I don't know personally, but Roman, spelled Roman, R-O-M-A-N, Buehler, B-U-H-L-E-R, at the coalition can answer that question specifically, and his phone number is 202-255-5000. That's the keep9.org office in Washington, D.C. He can tell you every elected official who's involved, and I wouldn't be surprised if he isn't involved.
Okay. Once again, Paul Sommers joining us again on In the Booth. Paul, thanks a lot for your time. It's been great to have you on again.
Jim, thank you so much for your interest. We appreciate you.
All right, folks, we will wrap up In the Booth right after this.
In the Booth will return after these quick but very important